provincial boundaries. So we've now done enough atlases in enough Canadian provinces that we can put that information all together. And we can get a pretty good picture of the national distribution of our breeding birds. And so the map there is for rusty blackbird, and it incorporates data from all of those atlases, from British Columbia all the way over to the Maritimes. You will, however, probably note that there are some slightly bizarre things about this map. One very noticeable thing is that rusty blackbirds stop breeding in a straight line halfway through Quebec. And the other thing is that there are no rusty blackbirds breeding in Newfoundland and Labrador. And those of you who are birders will know that we do indeed have rusty blackbirds here. And so this, of course, brings me to my main point. We are the only province that's currently lacking a modern bird atlas. So the map there shows the number of atlases by Canadian province. It's a little bit out of date because it shows Saskatchewan with no atlas. Saskatchewan has recently completed their 4th year of data collection, so they should be wrapping up next year. So all of the other provinces do have at least one breeding bird atlas. But Newfoundland is this big hole in our understanding of the status and the distribution of birds in Canada. Now, when I say birds in Newfoundland, this is what everybody thinks of. So everybody goes directly to the puffins. The logo of our atlas is indeed a puffin, and we thought we should take advantage of that. And I mean, we're well known for puffins for a good reason. We do have the largest North American colony of puffins in the Witless Bay Reserve. But there's a lot more to Newfoundland birds than just puffins. And so these guys, probably a number of you are familiar with because I know they're studied in the Montevecchi lab. Leach's storm petrels. We have the world's largest colony of Leach's storm petrels on Baccalieu Island. More than 3 million breeding pairs, which is pretty amazing. That's also more than 50% of the global population of Leach's storm petrels in Newfoundland. Perhaps it's surprising then that that so few people actually know these guys, but there are a couple good reasons for that. First of all, I discovered very early here that there's sometimes a terminology barrier. So many of you may know Mohammed, who's in that picture there. I was traveling with him out to South Penguin Island to do a little bit of reconnoiter for a Leach's storm petrel study. And we were going out with a local fisherman, and he asked what we were going out to look at. And I said, Leach's storm petrels. And he looked at me with complete incomprehension. And I thought, I know you know what I'm talking about, but I'm not sure that we're using the same words. And after about 10 minutes, we came to the conclusion that he knew them as Mother Carey's chicks. So he did know what I was talking about, just used the colloquial name for them, which I didn't know at all. So it was definitely a bit of a learning curve. Another reason that people aren't maybe super familiar with Leach's storm petrels is that they spend their days far out at sea. So they weigh under 50 grams, but they can forage as far as 1,200 kilometers out to sea. And then at night, they come back to their burrows. And then the final reason that people are maybe less familiar with them than we'd like is that we do have evidence showing some pretty massive declines. So lots and lots of seabirds here. Newfoundland is incredibly important for seabirds, but there's also a lot more here than just seabirds. So the book that I have pictured there, The Birds of Newfoundland, it was published in 1951, and it was part of a concerted effort, a cooperation between the Newfoundland Department of Resources and US Fish and Wildlife Service to basically create an inventory of the birds in the province. And so that actually is the precursor to the atlas we have. So similar to what we're trying to create, they have species accounts, and they've made a pretty good stab at figuring out what the distribution of those species are. One of the things that those authors, Peters and Burley, were particularly interested in was species of birds where the Newfoundland individuals looked different or behaved differently than the mainland individuals. And so essentially they were trying to identify endemic subspecies. And there are a number of those. The one that I wanted to highlight here, just as an example, is our red crossbill. So the red crossbill's subspecies in Newfoundland is the Perkna subspecies. They are morphologically distinct. They are larger than other red crossbills. They're also vocally distinct. So this is flight calls of Newfoundland red crossbills on the top and mainland red crossbills on the bottom. So we have a lot of these distinct subspecies. And so I think really what I'm trying to get at here is that Newfoundland is an important place for birds and not just seabirds. We have a lot of diversity here, and we have a lack of knowledge. And that's really what we're proposing to fill with the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. So the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas is a partnership between all of those organizations at the top. We've got federal government involvement from Canadian Wildlife Service and Parks Canada, provincial government involvement. Several members of our advisory committee are Memorial University. And then we also have other NGOs involved, so the Stewardship Association of Municipalities and the Eastern Habitat Joint Venture. But we at Birds Canada are leading the Atlas. Atlases are kind of one of our flagship programs at Birds Canada. And many of you probably do know Birds Canada or Bird Studies Canada. So we actually were Bird Studies Canada until about 10 months ago when we made a switch to Birds Canada. That's our official name now. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are an NGO. We are the leading bird conservation NGO in Canada. And our mission is to advance the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of wild birds and their habitats. And I think one of the things that's really important to point out about Bird Studies or Birds Canada, see, I still do that, is that we are a citizen science organization. So a lot of our programs are really aimed at engaging volunteers. And I think it's a pretty amazing stat that each year our programs engage more than 30,000 volunteers across Canada. So we're taking the lead on this atlas, and this is what we're aiming to do. So we're aiming to map the distribution and the abundance of all of the species of birds that breed on the island of Newfoundland. I'm going to guess that somebody would probably like to ask about Labrador. We can talk about it a little bit more later, but right now Labrador is outside of the scope of this atlas. We're looking at doing this over the next 4 years. So 2020 was our first year of data collection. We've got 4 more seasons to go. And the peak season for our data collection is the 7th of June to the 7th of July. What we're asking people to do is basically just record and report their sightings. So what species they see, where they were, when they saw it, and what time of year it was. And then there's really, with breeding bird atlases, there's an emphasis on also what the bird was doing. So there's this idea that breeding behaviors are important. What do I mean by breeding behaviors? Things like courtship displays or carrying food. Those are really obvious ones. Obviously, if you actually find a nest, that's pretty good confirmed evidence of breeding. But even seeing things like the recently fledged young horned lark on the bottom there, that's also really good evidence of breeding in a given location. And so we've put together, generally for atlases, this table of breeding evidence codes. And that's sort of, we've classified them into 3 different categories. So we have things that indicate possible breeding, like singing. So if you see a bird singing, you know it's there, you know it's in the right habitat, you know it's advertising. You don't necessarily know if it's actually breeding. The next level up is probable breeding. So things like observing a pair of individuals or courtship displays or birds getting agitated when you're around. And then the top level is confirmed breeding, and that's things like finding a nest, as in the previous picture, but also building a nest, carrying food, or birds that do distraction displays like killdeers to try and lead you away from their nest. And so the goal of the atlas is to get the highest level of breeding evidence possible for the birds that you see. And that can be used to generate maps like this. So this map is obviously from the Saskatchewan Breeding Bird Atlas because we don't have our species maps from our first year of data yet. Hopefully that'll come in the next month. But this is for belted kingfishers. And you can see there that the yellow squares indicate places where the birds are possibly breeding, orange is probable, and red is confirmed. So you get a really good distribution map, also associated with a level of certainty of breeding. So how have we actually designed the Newfoundland Atlas? You'll notice in the previous map, what you have there are these squares. And that's because that's the basic unit of atlasing. So the essential unit is an atlas square, which is a 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer square. And in Newfoundland, that happens to work out to 1,485 squares. And yes, I do see this number in my sleep. That's a big number to try and cover over the next 4 years. To try and make it a little bit easier administratively, we've combined those squares into 8 regions. which you can see on the map there. Some of you may notice that one of our regions actually isn't in Newfoundland at all. So St. Pierre and Miquelon is a region of our atlas. That makes sense from a biological perspective. It's also kind of cool because I think it makes us the only international breeding bird atlas that's been done. We were hoping that it meant that the French government would like to fund the atlas, but that hasn't happened yet. We'll see. So each of those regions are managed by a regional coordinator, a volunteer, sometimes more than one. And then if you look at the map, you'll notice that there are also dots in some of the squares. And essentially, we realized that getting to almost 1,500 squares over the next 4 years is not going to be possible. So what we've done is designate 2 levels of priority squares. And really, this was done systematically, as you can probably tell by looking at the map. So it's not because those squares are particularly biologically important, it's actually to ensure even coverage. So we don't want a situation where all of the squares on the Avalon are well covered, but then we have a giant gaping hole in the middle of the island. So 25% of our squares are priority 1 squares, and then an additional 15% are second priority squares. And for the most part, as I said, that was done systematically, although we did do a little bit of rearranging to make sure that coastal squares were adequately covered. Now, when I say that we don't want a gaping hole in the middle of the island, I sort of want to highlight one of the reasons that it's important that we do a breeding bird atlas here. So some of you I know for sure are birders and will be quite familiar with eBird, which is the Cornell Lab program where birders enter their observations. And so I have been asked before why we need an atlas when we already have tools like eBird, which map out the distribution of species. But the problem with things like eBird is that there is no attempt to make sure that there's even coverage. So eBird records come in when birders choose to go to places. And so if you look at the eBird map for this species, the boreal chickadee, you'll see that big gaping hole in the south central part of the island. So it's not that there are no boreal chickadees in south central Newfoundland, but there aren't any birders there who are reporting the chickadees. And so the atlas gives us a way to try and target this coverage and make sure that we are getting even coverage across all of Newfoundland. So 1,485 squares, you guys are going to know this number as well as I do by the end of this presentation. Clearly, even with our priority square system, it's not something that one organization or even a partnership, like the one I was describing for the atlas, it's not something that we can do by ourselves. But that's okay because we don't have to. So at their foundation, atlases are massive citizen science projects. So the idea is that birders are going out anyway and they're collecting information, and we want to gather that information as it comes in. And I think it's actually pretty cool that if you look at Canadian Atlas projects combined, they have involved more than 9,000 volunteers and over 400,000 hours of atlasing, which is unbelievable. So in terms of recruiting citizen scientists, there are sort of different levels of involvement and different protocols that we're asking for. And so I'm going to kind of go through the 3 of them quickly because, spoiler alert, part of my goal with this presentation is to recruit some of you graduate students to contribute observations to the atlas. So we've got 3 different protocols. We've got incidental observations, general atlasing, and point counts. And incidental observations, that's sort of your lowest level of commitment to the atlas. Essentially, it's anything you see anywhere, usually while you're not out birding. So you happen to be driving along and a grouse walks across the road in front of you. That is something that you can report to the atlas. Or you are going on a hike and you notice a pair of loons with a chick in the lake. That's something you can report to the atlas. There's no measure of effort associated with incidental observations. It's just the observation. And we're looking primarily from late May to mid-August, but lots of species breed earlier and later than that. So if you, for example, were to see evidence of one of our owl species breeding in April, that could absolutely be submitted as an incidental observation. Incidental observations tell us about presence. It tells us that that species is breeding at the location near the location where you saw it. Because there is no effort associated with it, it doesn't tell us anything about absence. So we don't know for sure that it's not breeding in the surrounding squares. We just know that it is breeding where you saw it. The next step up is general atlasing, and this is essentially a search of a square. And so what we're looking for is about 12 to 20 hours of general atlasing per square. That doesn't all have to be done in 1 year. That can be spread out over the full 5 years, but we'll call a square complete when we've got that much effort put into it. And again, this is primarily from late May to mid-August, but this also gives us absence information. So if you spend 20 hours in a square and don't see something, we can be a little bit more confident saying that it isn't there. And you'll notice that one of those images is a map. So these are the tools that we have for general atlasing. We have these square maps for every square. I think this one is near Port Basque, and they show you where the roads are, as well as the different habitat types available. So there's the legend that goes with the square map. And essentially, when you're doing general atlasing, you want to make sure that you're hitting all of the habitat types available in the square, and also that you're representing them approximately proportionally. So in this case, we have a square that has about 45% broadleaf forest and 12% of shrubland. So you wouldn't want to spend 50% of your time in the shrubland. You want to make sure that your 50% of time is going into the most common habitat type there. So for general atlasing, as I said, we're looking for 12 to 20 hours per square, but each species needs to be confirmed only once. So you're looking to confirm the species is breeding there, and you're looking for the highest level of breeding evidence. Some of the strategies for general atlasing, so you can complete 1 or more squares in a year if you're out birding a lot. You can complete squares over a few years. As I said, those 20 hours, they do not have to be done all in 1 year. And then in some cases where we've got access issues, shall we say, you may just have to blitz a square over a few days. You put in all of that time at once. It's not the ideal situation because obviously the more you spread it out, the more likely you are to catch bird species that breed at different times. But if you are in a place that you're unlikely to get back to, blitzing is definitely what you have to do. There's a note there about square sign up. So a lot of people like to take ownership of a square, essentially. So they like to say, okay, this is my square. And when they do that, they're taking responsibility for completing the 12 to 20 hours of atlasing. That doesn't mean that nobody else can atlas in that square, and that doesn't mean they can't atlas in other squares. So ownership is maybe the wrong word there, because it doesn't mean that that square belongs to you, but it does mean that you've taken on some responsibility for it. And you do that through contacting a regional coordinator. I should say 12 to 20 hours, that's obviously a pretty big range. And the reason that we've got such a big range for general atlasing is that we've got a range of skill in the volunteers that we have. And so if you're a new birder, you might need a little bit more time to feel that you've sort of confidently covered all of the species that breed in a particular square. If you're a very experienced birder, maybe fewer hours will do. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is point counts. So if I go back to my square map there, you'll see those little crosses with numbers. And those are pre-designated point count locations. So probably most of you are familiar with point counts. They're a pretty common method in ornithology, but for those of you who aren't, they're timed counts at pre-specified locations. So they're basically exactly what they sound like. In the case of the atlas, that's a 5-minute count. And during those 5 minutes, you're recording all of the birds that you see and hear. However, since birds are much more often heard than seen, a lot of it involves birding by ear. And so generally speaking, atlases are inclusive. We want everybody to participate in an atlas. General atlasing can be done by anybody who has access to a pair of binoculars and an interest in identifying birds. Point counts are a little bit more specialized, and generally speaking, we only have experienced birders do point counts. The season for point counts is also a lot more restricted. So we only do point counts from the 7th of June to the 7th of July because that's sort of peak breeding for most species. And point counts are used to provide information about relative abundance. So that's where we get the second of those maps I showed you at the beginning. So the challenges associated with the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. I don't think it's a coincidence that Newfoundland is the last province, or Newfoundland and Labrador is the last province to have a breeding bird atlas. And in fact, we were up for discussion when Saskatchewan started theirs, and they chose to do Saskatchewan first because it was a little bit easier of a target. One of the big problems in Newfoundland is that we've got many remote, hard to access locations. So if you look at a roadmap of the island, or for those of you who were at Victoria Neville's seminar at the beginning of the semester and saw that map that she showed of human impact in Newfoundland, there's that big, wide open space in the middle of the province where it's going to be extremely challenging for us to actually access squares. How we're handling that challenge is mostly through partnerships. So Canadian Wildlife Service is launching a boreal monitoring strategy, which is going to see them get out to a lot of those remote locations. And we're hoping that either they will collect data for us or that we can send an atlaser along with them. We've also partnered with Parks Canada. So last summer, I had the opportunity to go out with Derek Whitaker at Gross Morin, and we accessed some of the backcountry that's only accessible by helicopter and did some atlasing there. And then I've emphasized, and you guys, because I know that graduate students, field biologists often get out to a lot of locations that other people don't. And so what we're hoping that you guys will do is, while you're out there doing your own work, submit some incidental observations, pay attention to what the birds are doing, because you have access to areas that we don't. And I seem to have the same slide twice here. So, okay, there we go. Moving on to the next slide. One of our other really big challenges is the small population of Newfoundland, and particularly the small population of experienced birders that can do things like those point counts. And there are a couple of ways that we're trying to solve this problem as well. So the first is through training and mentoring. We will be offering some beginner bird ID workshops and intermediate bird ID workshops, hopefully in person if things keep going the way they're going in Newfoundland, hopefully in person. And possibly as the Atlas moves along, also some mentoring opportunities. So we do have some really experienced, fantastic birders who are working with us who might be open to taking out newer birders in the field. And that is a wonderful way to learn. However, it's asking a lot for somebody who isn't a birder right now to be able to do point counts in a couple of years. Some people may be able to do that. Certainly, I still find point counts very much a challenge. And so another way that we are trying to deal with that is through the use of bioacoustics, which broadly speaking is the study of sound made by and affecting living organisms. And how that ties into the Atlas is we're talking about collecting bird survey data through audio recordings, essentially. And there are two different ways that we're doing that. So one is through the use of handheld Zoom recorders. Basically, we have some birders who are happy to go out to the point count locations, but aren't feeling fully confident of their point count abilities, or in some cases are actually losing their hearing. And so some of the higher pitched sounds may be hard for them to pick up. And so for those people, we have these recorders available to borrow, and they can go and stand at those point count locations and record 5 minutes of bird song. The other thing we're going to be using are these autonomous recording units, ARUs, or song meters. And that's the box you see in the picture there. You attach it to a tree, you program it, or well, you can attach it to anything really that's standing. You program it and it will turn itself on and collect data for you. And so here we can collect a lot more than 5 minutes of data. We can leave these out in the field for months or even up to a year, and they'll collect information for us. And actually, one of our really neat partnerships over this past summer was with Nalcor, and Nalcor put 50 of these out for us while they were doing some work on their transmission lines, and then collected them 2 months later. So those are our plans. That's how we intend to tackle the challenge of the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. And this was our timeline in the spring with our first year of data collection, as I said, beginning in May 2020. And then, of course, we dealt with exactly the same problem as everybody else. It turns out that in the middle of a pandemic is probably not the ideal time to launch a breeding bird atlas. So initially, Birds Canada actually canceled all of our surveys in April and May. And that was because even though birding itself can actually be a quite safe, socially distanced activity, we didn't want to be encouraging people to travel. So things that were an acceptable risk in other years, so for example, people doing nocturnal owl surveys or driving at night, there are potentially some collision risks there, traffic accident risks. And in other years, that's an acceptable risk, but this year we didn't want people taking that risk at all. So that was our initial stance. And then as things started to calm down a little bit, we essentially asked people to survey, but for the atlas, we were asking them to atlas their backyards, basically. So don't travel to Atlas, just see what you can find in your backyard. And as it turns out, a lot of people have much cooler backyards than I do. All I saw was a starling breeding, but some people saw some pretty neat stuff. However, as things sort of continued to calm down over the summer, we did actually have some atlasers do a little bit of traveling. We also had atlasers who were on their way out of the province to move to other provinces and collected data along their way. And so what we ended up with was really quite a surprise to us. So this map here shows our coverage, the amount of effort that's been put into the various squares just over the past 6 months or so. And really, we were incredibly happy with what we managed to get. So in our first year of data collection, we got data from 264 squares. Now that doesn't mean that all those squares are complete, obviously. You can see from the map there that many of them have less than 10 hours, but still, that's a huge proportion of squares that we actually did get data from. Atlas data are always submitted as a checklist. So as of, I think, yesterday morning, we had 1,063 checklists submitted, and our volunteers have put in 783 hours of atlasing, which is, again, super impressive, particularly for this summer. We currently have 84 registered participants, and overall, we've gotten data on breeding for 134 species. So as I said, we're really, really pleased with how this summer went, particularly given the context. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to highlight some of our really cool findings over this past summer. Because there's been some really neat stuff coming in. A lot of it is exactly what you'd expect, so lots and lots of robins, but we do have this record of a rough-legged hawk nest on the Avalon Peninsula, and part of the reason that we were really excited about this is if you look at Cornell University's breeding map for rough-legged hawks, you'll see that they are not in fact supposed to breed on the Avalon. So that was a really exciting find. Another exciting find was for this guy, the wood duck. And again, if you look at the map there, you'd see that they are not in fact supposed to breed in Newfoundland. And yet this photo was taken in Deer Lake this summer. So I guess there are often wood ducks seen there, but not usually a pair. And in this case, it was not only a pair, but it was a pair with ducklings. So again, we have confirmed breeding for a species that doesn't necessarily, or we didn't realize bred here. And then the last sighting that I have is not actually a particularly cool species. This is a northern flicker nest. I took this photo in Dildo Run Provincial Park up near Cottlesville. And the reason that I enjoy it is, well, first of all, it was kind of a fun find. So we were walking through the park after a long morning of bird surveys, heard a god-awful noise coming from a nearby tree. And I thought, that's gotta be baby birds, but it's in a cavity, we'll never see it. Just looked up and there were 3 of them basically with their heads hanging out of the hole, begging for food. So it was a neat find, but also I think what's interesting about this is flickers aren't a particularly exciting species. They're not a species at risk. They're not an uncommon species, but so far they've only been reported in 22% of the squares that we have data for. And that's not even necessarily confirmed breeding for them. So it's one of those cases where I think it's really important to point out that anyone can contribute to the atlas. So even if you're only familiar with flickers and robins, you can still make a valuable contribution to the atlas if you happen to observe breeding for flickers or for robins. That's important information for us to have. Okay, so a couple things that I want to cover before finishing up. And one is the benefit of an atlas. And I realize that this is probably preaching to the choir for the most part, because most of you can probably quite easily see what the benefits of an atlas would be. But it's a lot of work, obviously. It's a huge effort over, well, there's 5 years of data collection and then a couple years of preparation of the actual atlas. It's very expensive. And so I guess it begs the question of why are we doing it? And the first thing that I want to point out is that atlases are, relatively speaking, a cost-effective and scientifically rigorous way to evaluate ecosystem health. What do I mean by this? One of the really neat things about atlases is they're actually designed to be repeated every 20 years. And what that means is we can track what's going on with bird populations over time. So what you're seeing here are maps from the first and the second Maritimes breeding bird atlases. So the first atlas was done from, I always forget this, 1986 to 1990. And the second atlas was done from 2006 to 2010. And you're seeing there the probability of observation for barn swallows in the first atlas and in the second atlas. And then in the rightmost map, it's the difference between the probability of observation in the two atlases. And so I think it's pretty clear that you were significantly less likely to encounter a barn swallow during the second breeding bird atlas than you were during the first, particularly in northern New Brunswick. And it's not always bad news stories that we get out of atlases either. So just for comparison, I have a similar map for blue-headed vireo. And here you can see that you're actually more likely to encounter a blue-headed vireo, particularly in New Brunswick during the second atlas than you were during the first. So it really gives us a really strong way to look at what's going on with bird populations over time. But on top of that, you'll probably remember I said ecosystem health, not bird population health. Birds are great indicator species. So birds are pretty much everywhere. They're relatively easy to see, and they're sensitive to anthropogenic disturbance and to stressors. And so what's going on with bird populations can actually tell us a lot about what's going on with ecosystems. And that's why atlases can be such a great tool to monitor ecosystem health. Because of that, they're a really powerful tool to inform conservation decisions and public policy. And this can happen at multiple scales. So it can be local, it can also be regional. It can be national when we combine the atlases, the information from all the atlases. And so again, I want to stress that this doesn't always have to mean bad news. It doesn't have to mean identifying species that are in trouble or identifying locations that are threatened. It can also mean good news. And so the slide that I have here, it's got 9 different species, all of which were actually downlisted. So these species were of conservation concern in some degree or another, and the level of threat to them was actually decreased based on data collected for the British Columbia Breeding Bird Atlas. And then the final benefit of an atlas. So, I say that the goal of an atlas is to map out all the bird species breeding in a given jurisdiction. And that is one of our goals. But our other goal is outreach. So we want to get people outside, enthused about birds, learning to bird. And an atlas, as it turns out, is a really, really great outreach tool. And so I'm hoping that you will join us in putting Newfoundland's birds on the map and that you'll help us out. And since I have a few extra minutes, I'm just going to go through. I know that many of you will be birders, and so this information won't be particularly helpful to you. But I also know that many of you aren't birders, or some of you may, like me, study birds and still not be a birder. So I spent a lot of time really, really focused on bluebirds and tree swallows and not a whole lot of time paying attention to other things. So I am very much learning to be a birder, and these are some of the resources that I found helpful. The first is these birding backpacks that Nature NL has put together. So I said anybody with access to a pair of binoculars and an interest in observing birds can contribute to the atlas. This can solve your access to binoculars problem if you have one. So you can borrow these from the library. They come complete with binoculars and bird guides. If you prefer to travel a little bit light, I tend not to take my field guides into the field, largely because I almost always drop them in a puddle when I do so. So a lot of people are using smartphone apps to ID birds, and there's a whole range of them. But the one that I want to focus on is Merlin, because Merlin is free. It's from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it helps you out with bird ID. So essentially, it will ask you a series of questions where you are when you saw the bird. Either you can put in your postal code, or you can let it pick your phone's current location, what the date is, roughly the size of the bird. So it's got these categories. Is it sparrow-sized or smaller, robin-sized, crow-sized? And then it'll ask you the main colors. So in the case of this, let's say mystery bird here, we'll say black and yellow. And finally, it asks you what the bird was doing, which is also useful for atlasing because it's something that we want people to start thinking about. What was the bird doing when you saw it? You input all that information, you get the spinning wheel of doom briefly, and then it will generate a list of potential uh, identifications. So in this case, it gets it right off the top. It's an American goldfinch. So if you're new to birding and feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the many, many pages of a field guide, Merlin can be a really, really useful way to get into it. And then there are also a couple other online options to test your skills as you're learning to bird. So if you register for an eBird account, you can actually do these free online eBird quizzes. And for a while, Nature NL was actually doing a weekly collaborative eBird quiz. So it was something you could attend virtually. I believe they're going to be doing it maybe a little bit less frequently this fall. So you can check out one of their sessions. Essentially, what you do is you can tell eBird you'd like to look at photos or listen to songs, and you provide it with a date and location. So I could say I want to try and identify birds that I might see in St. John's in September. And then it will generate a list of 20 questions, photos, or some things about eBird quizzes is that it's based on the photos that have been submitted to eBird. And many of them are great. Some of them are really, really terrible photos. But that's actually incredibly helpful because when you're in the field, you don't always get the best view of a bird. And then the last tool that I want to highlight is this resource, Dendroica. So Dendroica was developed by the Canadian, American, and Mexican governments, and essentially it's a guide to identifying Western Hemisphere birds. And you can use it, customize it much the way you can with the eBird quizzes. So you can use it to generate a list of birds that breed in Newfoundland and make up custom quizzes based on that list. And like eBird, it also does photos and vocalizations. So it's a great way to test your skills as well. And with that, I'm just going to put up our contact information and say that I really, really hope you guys will join us and contribute Atlas data while you're out in the field over the next few years. And I will take questions.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was awesome.
Thank you.
And I think Ian Jones also says it's brilliant from the chat. So for questions, if you could write that you have a question in the chat, or write out your question in the chat, that's fine. But if you say I have a question, then I can let you know, and you can unmute yourself, maybe even put your video on if you'd like, and you can ask it. So do we have anyone to start questions? Well, I can ask one.
Go for it.
An easy one I was thinking about, because before you were talking about identification guides and stuff, I was thinking about like how long do you think it would take someone like me who does not know anything about birds? How long would it take until you feel confident sending me out into the forest and like giving you data? Is it a couple workshops, like, especially if you can't see the birds, and you're just IDing based on calls?
So ID based on vocalizations is a little bit different. Generally speaking, I would say I would trust you right now to tell me if you saw a robin breeding, to tell me if you saw a starling breeding. So even when people say they don't know anything at all about birds, it's often the case that they know more than they think about some of the commonly seen birds. So, if you see a blue jay, you know that you saw a blue jay. And so really our big request is only submit records that you're really sure of. So if you're not sure what you saw, maybe don't submit that record. In terms of sending you out to do point counts, we're actually developing a point count self-evaluation tool that's going to be available on our website. So people can kind of quiz themselves and see what they feel comfortable doing. We think that most people, well, first of all, probably most people aren't going to be able to do point counts. Point counts are a very specialized skill. As I said, it's something I'm learning to do right now. So I think you really want to be pretty sure of your ability to identify birds by sound. It can be really crazy. You've got 5 minutes. You're trying to identify everything you hear, count the number of individuals of each species you hear. So it's something you probably do want a little bit of practice at. But again, we do have those recorders. So if it's something you think you might be able to do, but you're not entirely sure, I would suggest borrowing a recorder, taking it out, and then you've got a backup for what you hear during that time period.
And so who is taking all those recordings and like processing them? Would that be the responsibility of the people who are taking them?
That is a really good question. No, it's not the responsibility of the people collecting the recordings. So we have an assistant coordinator who is finishing her master's at MUN in Grand Fall at the moment, Jenna. And so at the moment, it's looking like it may be Jenna's job. At some point, it may become my job, or we may hire field technicians to do it, or sorry, data technicians, not field technicians. So I think the only for sure answer I can give you is it's not the responsibility of the person who takes the recording.
Perfect.
Unless they want it to be. If they want to.
I think Stephanie asked a similar question, actually, that I did.
Who goes through the recording data? Yeah. Yeah, this is something Saskatchewan is struggling with right now because they have hundreds and hundreds of hours of recording. So obviously, from our point of view, if you can do the point count yourself, that's preferable because it doesn't just sort of put the analysis, put the data collection part of it off until later. But if you're not confident, then, or you just want to back up, then that's what the recorders are for.
Perfect. I think Levi has a question.
Yeah, thanks for the talk, Catherine. Like, that's super informative and interesting. It's nice to know that this is happening here now. I have a question about like, if I'm understanding correctly, like you're getting, when people survey a square, they're getting negative data if they, or you were getting negative data if they don't see birds?
It does give us, yeah, it gives us absence data as well as presence data. I think that's what you're saying, right?
Yes. So I'm just wondering how you account for like I guess if I'm like a new birder versus someone who's been birding for 20 years, how do you account for like the difference in like absence data between like a really experienced birder versus a new birder?
And that's a really good question, and we don't really is the short version of it. 20 hours is a lot of birding time. Also, in most cases, you've got a lot of different people contributing to squares. So for example, some of the squares in the St. John's area, you're going to have multiple contributors. If you're a new birder, you're probably less likely to travel out to some of the remote places where we're not going to get a lot of people covering a square. And so the maybe somewhat unsatisfying answer to your question is that the experience level of the birder doesn't really get put into the analysis. It just sort of all comes out in the wash, which I realize, as I said, is quite unsatisfying as an answer.
But it sort of makes sense, I guess.
Yeah, when you've got this kind of massive effort, there is a fair amount that does sort of end up all coming out in the wash.
Yeah. So you find then that like in those remote areas, like in the interior of Newfoundland, that would be mostly people coming from like St. John's or like other major centers to like specifically go and bird out there.
Yeah, I think actually with a lot of those very difficult to access places, we're going to have potentially CWS people out there covering it. In some cases, possibly hired field techs, although to be honest, our budget doesn't really account for that right now. But yeah, I think you're going to see that with some of the more remote places, you're more likely to get very hardcore birders in those areas or professional birders.
Okay, thank you.
It's a great question.
Cole, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, cool. Thanks for that talk, Catherine. That was great. I'm wondering, so what kind of process went into the initiation? I might have missed it in the presentation, but I mean, how long was this in the works before you guys were like, okay, we're starting summer 2020, we're running it for, 4 or 5 years? And I mean, and I guess I'm also interested in how you also went from your PhD at Queen's and then started into this bird breeding atlas. Yeah,
I'm still figuring that out myself, to be honest. So there are a couple answers to your questions about the development of the atlas. If you look at the atlas methodologies, sort of generally, there's a lot of thought that's gone into the development of atlas methodologies because they're standardized across atlases. So we didn't have to figure out a lot of this ourselves in terms of the 10 by 10 kilometer atlas squares, in terms of the amount of coverage we wanted. We're using previously established protocols. So Birds Canada has been involved with atlases across the country since the 80s. We've got a system relatively down pat now. There's actually one of our staff members had literally written the book on doing atlases. There's a North American ornithological atlas handbook that was written by Gregor Beck, who works at Birds Canada. So there's a lot of experience and thought that's gone into that. Much of it not by me, done by other people who know a lot more than I do. In terms of the Newfoundland Atlas specifically, it's been an interesting journey, I think. So Newfoundland has almost done an atlas a number of times before. It's come up repeatedly, I think particularly over the last 10 years or so, and just sort of, there's always been a lack of momentum. It's never quite translated into actually getting the atlas going. And I think I said that we were up for contention in the atlas cycle when Saskatchewan started their atlas, and they decided to go for Saskatchewan first. This time, they were considering doing an atlas in the Yukon and doing an atlas in Newfoundland. So they decided it was a little bit easier to do it in Newfoundland than in the Yukon. The decision to actually go ahead, we've sort of been taking the approach of, we're just going to keep going till somebody tells us to stop, because we do feel like we have built up momentum now, and that it would be a shame to lose what we've built up so far. So I'm not really sure that there was a hard decision point. When I was initially brought on to this job, the idea was to do a feasibility analysis of the Newfoundland Atlas. So was it something that we could actually carry out? But the funny thing was, nobody ever really specified what would make it feasible. And so we just have kind of, we've started, and we'll go as far as we can. We may have to modify some of our goals. We may have to modify some of our protocols depending on what success we have. But yeah, it's kind of where we're going with this. Does that answer your question?
Perfect.
Anyone else have any more questions for Catherine?
If there are no more questions.
Great. Well,
sorry, I was just going to say, actually, I have one more slide, which I'm going to share. I left it because it's not Birds Canada related. So I want to specify I'm switching hats here, but also make another advertisement for MUN grad student contributions. So I co-manage a blog called Dispatches from the Field. It was developed with a few of my colleagues at Queen's, and we use it as an outreach tool. So the idea is to share some of the stories from the field that never make it into scientific publications, but ultimately are, for a lot of us, the reason that we do what we do. And so we alternate between posts written by myself and my co-founders and posts written by guest posters from all over the world. So I think our most recent post was from a grad student who studies snow leopards, but has in fact never seen a snow leopard. So apparently this is one of the challenges when you study things like large cats. You may be studying a species that you're not entirely sure exists. Anyway, I recommend reading her blog. And as I said, we're always looking for contributions. So if any of you are interested in working on your popular science writing skills and getting a publication out of it, just send us an email.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for coming and presenting today. I hope that lots of people contact you soon with, interested in birding, especially for next summer. So you were saying that Nature NL is going to have some workshops on learning to bird. Would those be in the fall?
A couple of, so we are, Birds Canada is working on developing introduction to birding workshops, which hopefully we'll be offering this fall. But you're right, Nature NL also does, I believe it's going to be, I think they're aiming for monthly, although don't quote me on that, these eBird quiz evenings. So they do these hour-long sessions where they set up an eBird quiz. They usually have expert birders there, like Jared Clark, for example, and they'll kind of help the audience through this eBird quiz. So it's a fun collaborative effort, and you learn a lot about what marks to look for in the field and that sort of thing. And one of the things I found really surprising is looking at photos where my instinct is just to say, I absolutely cannot identify that. That's a blurry bird out on a lake. And yet, if you look really closely, there are marks that you can use to identify it. So,
wow, that's pretty cool. Great. Yeah, thank you so much. So I guess that's
Thank
the end
you.
of the question period. If anyone wants to stay behind, we can do an extended discussion. So we can start that soon. Thank you everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
So, Catherine, do we just get in touch with regional coordinators on the website if we're interested in volunteering?
Yeah, so you can just sign up. That's one option. There's a register button on the website. Or you can get in touch with the regional coordinator. Usually you only need to get in touch with the regional coordinator if you actually want to take on a square. So if you want to say, I would like to be assigned this square, I'm taking this on, this is, I'm committing to providing the 20 hours of atlasing, which I'm guessing a lot of graduate students don't, because that's a lot of time to commit, and often people aren't necessarily going to be here for the next 4 years. So you can liaise with the regional coordinator, but if all you want to do is submit observations, you can also just sign up on the website.
Cool.
I should have asked this question earlier, but I'm puppy sitting and it was going to maybe be chaos. But I was just curious, like, how does funding differ provincially? Like, is there some incentive to repeat a survey in one province versus start, like, obviously having global or like federal distribution would be ideal, but does the individual province play a role in saying we'll fund a certain amount to have a second survey here?
It's a really good question. In some ways, I'm kind of glad you didn't ask it when there were more people. So funding absolutely does vary across provinces pretty massively. I think it was the second Ontario Breeding Bird Atlas, which was 2001 to 2005. They had sort of the perfect funding scenario. It was either them or BC. I can't remember which one, but the idea was they had a third federal funding, mostly from Canadian Wildlife Service, and then a third provincial funding and a third industry funding. And that's sort of the ideal model of how an atlas would work. I will say that the government of Newfoundland and Labrador is not going to be giving us a third of our budget. I can guarantee that. As of right now, they haven't actually given us anything, except for in-kind support, which they have provided and are more than willing to provide. So that's also fantastic, because they're going to have biologists going out to remote places, and hopefully they can collect data for us too. It also depends a lot on who the provincial government is. So Ontario is about to launch their third breeding bird atlas starting next summer, because they're up. It's been 20 years since their last one. And I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that Doug Ford's government is also maybe not going to be committing an awful lot of money to a breeding bird atlas. So there is a huge variation in terms of what the province is willing to commit. In terms of the value of like a first atlas in Newfoundland versus a third atlas in Ontario, it's a great question, and there's no easy answer. It's a discussion that Birds Canada definitely had, because we take on significant responsibility for an atlas, and a lot of the funding comes from us, even in terms of staff time. So atlases are huge projects for our database coordinator, who works out of Ontario, and our mapping coordinator. So huge portions of their staff time go towards this. You can make an argument either way. So, I really emphasize the fact that Newfoundland is this huge gap in our understanding of how Canadian birds are distributed. Rusty blackbirds do breed here, but they're not on that map, that sort of thing. On the other hand, you could see how being able to track populations over 60 years with a third Ontario atlas is potentially more useful. And I think you can argue it either way, and I'm not even sure there's a right answer to it. I think the ideal answer is we have enough money to do all of them. So, if any of you guys have a spare $2.5 million, let me know.
Absolutely, no problem. One day, right?
Yeah, right?
Is there maybe you mentioned this, sorry, I might have missed it, but is there kind of an ideal timeline in between surveys? Like, is it about 20 years or like in
It
an
is
ideal
20
survey-
years.
Okay, 20 years. Okay.
Yeah, and to be honest, that was one of those things that that's just sort of an established Atlas protocol, and I'm not sure what the science is behind that. I don't know why 20 years. I'm guessing partly you give people enough time to recover from the first Atlas, but you still have the expertise that you had in the last Atlas. So the guy who's leading the third Ontario Atlas was also in charge of the second
Well,
Ontario
that's super
Atlas.
neat. And then is there hopefully plans in the works to try and get the territories as well, or is that just kind of too daunting to kind of think about at the moment?
So as far as I know, there is no official plan for the territories right now. That doesn't mean that they won't be in the works at some point. The same thing applies to Labrador. I think when you're talking about the territories and when you're talking about Labrador, the big thing is that the traditional Atlas model probably won't work. So you probably can't do it all by citizen science. You're probably not going to get the same level of coverage. And so we need to figure out what will work before we start launching atlases in those places, I think. And I know that a question with the Yukon was, given that Canadian Wildlife Service is doing this boreal monitoring strategy, it then becomes a question of like, what would an atlas be able to add on top of that? Here, I think we have enough people and enough access to remote squares that we will be able to add, but that maybe gets a little bit dicey once you're talking about the Yukon.
Yeah, that's fair. Cool.
I wonder if you could like combine
It's
it
tough
with
though
like grad
because,
studies.
sorry.
I just wonder if you could combine it with like grad student projects. Like if you had the funding, I guess it like increases the amount of funding you need, but because like surveys can be done that are pretty basic, like it's a pretty basic deliverable, and then students can like build projects on top of that. And there's a lot of students who are interested in like Arctic studies.
Yeah, and I agree. And it's something that we've thought about even in Newfoundland. Like, I mean, what I was asking for today was, just while you're out collecting your own data, collect Atlas data too. But I think there is potential for for like pulling student projects into it. So I know that Derek Whitaker and Ian Workington have done a lot of work on whether squirrels are impacting particularly gray-cheeked thrush in Newfoundland. And so, these larger regional scale surveys could potentially shed some light on that question. The problem is you really do need to find particular questions that you can answer with Atlas surveys, and also that you can answer within the length of time allocated for a student project with relative security. Because I can personally speak to what happens when you take on a really risky project and you end up taking a hell of a lot longer to finish a PhD than you thought you were going to. So there are potentially some stumbling blocks, but I think there's a lot of potential in the idea and it could work.
Yeah, I guess it's like an option. There's lots of ways to do it. But I just I can imagine that if you're like worried about those blank spaces in Newfoundland, can you even imagine in like Northwest Territories or like Nunavut? Like there's just nothing, like there's no roads for like 30 or 70 like 30 to 70% of these territories. Like there's just nothing. There's not even like communities small. It would take so much money, but that would make it interesting.
It definitely would. Like I said, I think it would be a different model. I mean, it's funny because when I moved here for the Atlas specifically. And initially I thought, there's no reason we shouldn't do Labrador too. Like Labrador's got to be manageable. You can't do half of a province. And it actually creates a lot of problems in my presentations because I keep catching myself saying provincial and the province, and it's not actually the province. It's only half of the province. However, I remember getting off the ferry in Port aux Basques and driving to St. John's. And as I drove across Newfoundland, getting more and more and more panicked. And by the time I got to St. John's, I thought, oh my God, we can't Atlas this. Never mind Labrador, how are we going to manage Newfoundland? So yeah, I can't even imagine the challenge of taking on something like the Northwest Territories. Like it just blows my mind.
Have you heard about, there's this group of grad students in Quebec that did this like huge Nordic expedition, where it's 4 grad students. One of them was in forestry, one of them was in entomology. I can't remember what the other 2, and they just canoed from a part of Labrador down to like not Labrador City, but almost like to the Strait of Benin, basically. And they just collected data. And I feel like they had another one planned for maybe last year where they were going to Nunavut.
Wow.
But it seems like maybe something like that. Like we just need to send out these like random people that for 3 months, and they just need to like canoe around or like walk around and just do like huge transects. I'm sure somebody would be interested. But yeah, it's like possible. Like there are people doing
tourism.
There was a special name for the.
Make some money off of it or something.
Sorry?
I was gonna say if you turn it into like an ecotourism thing and actually make some money off of it. Almost.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's actually.
Well, I mean, the funny thing is, if we ever actually get any funding from the provincial government, it will probably be from tourism. Mind you, this is probably not the year to be asking them for money, but in theory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my.
Sorry, kind of changing topics a little bit, but do programs where there are like large quantities or like concentrations of like nest boxes play a role into the breeding bird atlas? So like in Nova Scotia, where I did my undergrad, we had tree swallow nest boxes and like quite, probably over 200 of them in a very small area, and so potentially drawing birds out of other squares, I guess, in some respects. So does that really matter in Acadia?
Okay, yeah, you worked with Marty Leonard's lab.
Yes, absolutely.
That's who I did my master's with. So
oh, hilarious.
Yeah, although not on tree swallows. That was the deal when I started, and then I realized that it was possible to like go to Sable Island, and so I made everybody's life a lot more complicated than it needed to be.
I mean, good for you though. But I would have loved to do that instead.
Yeah, I may have traumatized Marty. She may not have been pushing that as an option after I was done. So I think because atlases, it wouldn't matter in terms of the distribution maps, which are the fundamental, really kind of the fundamental product of an atlas. So first of all, you're talking about a 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer square. So it's unlikely that, your box population is necessarily going to be having an impact at that scale. And then, I mean, the only difference it might make is in terms of abundance. But I don't even know if it matters if it makes a difference, because really atlases are about what we're actually seeing on the landscape. So, if indeed this is what is there, these box populations, then that should be reflected in the atlas.
So it doesn't matter that there might be like this one area that has such a high proportion versus another area.
No, and I mean also things like tree swallows, you're surveys. So yeah. And in terms of the distribution map, it's just a presence absence thing, right? So do tree swallows breed in this square? Yes, they do. How many of them breed is not that important.
Makes sense. There's other, I guess, surveys designed to look at population density.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the distribution maps are really just a presence absence thing, but can still give us a lot of information.
Well, thank you very much. I should probably run here, but that was a really great presentation, and definitely I'm not a birder, but definitely something that, I don't know, I would love to get into more one day for sure. It's just very daunting.
I'm not a birder either, so this has been very much a learning experience for me. I literally used to categorize birds as that's a bluebird, and so I care about it. That's not a bluebird. I don't have time to look at it. So it's been a big journey for me.
My only claim to fame, not even fame, but was while I was doing my other field work, I found a natural cavity nest of a tree swallow in the middle of the woods, and I was like, this is amazing. And that was probably the only thing I'll ever do in terms of birds from this point forward. I'm definitely in the mammal stream now, but it is pretty amazing.
Another one lost to mammals. What is it that you study now? Okay, that's pretty cool. I mean, in terms of charismatic megafauna,
It
that's
definitely
pretty
grabs your
cool.
attention. Yeah, but I do love the tree swallows still.
Well, next time you find a natural cavity nest, submit it to the atlas. That's good atlas data. That's confirmed breeding for a tree swallow in that location.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, maybe we should organize with the BGSA. We could try to organize a bunch of biology students once we're allowed to get into groups, maybe to do like a workshop or something. Because I'm sure there'd be a lot of biologists who maybe aren't birders now, but like I know I'd be really interested in just learning more about birds and like trying to contribute. So maybe that's something we could put on the
That's a really
docket.
great idea.
Like maybe in the spring.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting that a lot of, if you don't, yeah, spring would be a good time for bird survey. And I think maybe something I've realized since graduating is that people assume if you're a biologist, you know how to identify things. And I don't know about you guys, but I find that most of us don't.
Absolutely.
So it is maybe a useful thing to pick up. I have a friend who just finished her PhD, and she texted me. She's like, "How am I going to find a job? Everybody assumes I can identify things, but I can't identify anything except this particular beetle that I studied." You know.
It's
So
daunting.
yeah, it could potentially be a workshop of interest. It is. It really is.
Mm-hmm. I don't know anything about anything. I
Yeah.
know a little bit about
Yeah,
dragonfly larvae and a little bit about salmonids, and that's it. Nothing else.
I hate to say this, but I also don't know anything about anything. And I think the big thing I learned from grad school was how little I knew about everything. So technically, you're ready to graduate now, I think.
Oh, that's good.
I'm
I'm
actually
just starting my
close to-
second year, so I'm ready to graduate too.
I better get going as well. But thank you again for the talk. That was definitely
Thanks very
inspired me
much.
to if you are doing any kind of I'm interested to hear if you are doing any kind of workshops in the future. That's something I would also be interested in. Also knowing nothing about birds.
Yeah.
I love the idea of doing a workshop, and that's a fantastic idea. So maybe we'll touch base again. Has MUN decided for sure that they're going to be all virtual in the spring? What's the
Virtual until April or May.
okay?
At least like the winter semester.
And who knows what it'll look like. Like maybe we'll be able to have small groups, or like people can do it on their we'll have to find a way, but maybe I can contact you in like late winter next year, and we could try to come up with a plan based on what Memorial says is allowed, because it might just be a nice way to get everyone out and like doing stuff, and it would be a pretty good distanced, like we could keep it distanced if we have to.
Absolutely. And I mean, we could even do, so there's usually like an in-class part of the workshop, just kind of generally like, how do you set up your binoculars? How do you find things with your binoculars? What are the sort of characteristics that you pay attention to when you're trying to identify something? But that part could be possibly done virtually ahead of time. And then there could be a meetup for a bird walk or something to that effect. I mean, it's always better to do things in person. And like, I was really surprised that the Rooms is doing talks in person again now.
So am I.
I was super taken aback when they were like, no, this is in person. You have to come to the Rooms. I was like, leave my living room? No.
Oh my
But
God.
yeah, we can wait and see what it's like, but for sure, just get back in touch and we'll set something up.
Perfect. Especially since field work will probably be more back to normal next summer. It'd be a really good time to capitalize. Yeah.
That's what we're hoping. We're hoping to get more unpaid work out of grad students. Sorry about that.
We're just willing to give. We will.
That is the lovely thing about graduate students.
Thanks, Catherine.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys.
Bye. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks. Bye.